the simple framing here is why your paycheck keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but you actually feel like you have less money. That's the reverse of what we're talking about. It erodes the purchasing power of that single dollar.
And people see that across the globe. I am Egyptian. The Egyptian pound has been devalued a ton. There's been crazy inflation. The inflation in that country and inflation in other countries as well. We've had recent stories about inflation in Turkey, inflation in Argentina. That devalues the currency faster than people can make more money, faster than investments grow. And what you're left with is a population or potentially investors, consumers that have less actual true dollars to spend and to consume with. What the Fed really is in place to do is set the rules and set the guardrails so that investors are protected when it comes to purchasing power.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of AWM Insights. It's your host, Justin Dyer, Chief Investment Officer here at AWM, joined as always by Mena Hanna, our portfolio manager here at AWM Capital. And we're going to continue this teeing up hype cycle, whatever you want to call it. You know, we're the best hype men around, I guess you could say. But of this interview we have coming up in the not too distant future. That interview is happening in a few days, actually, and we're going to release it over probably a couple different episodes, or even maybe in an off-cycle manner. But it's really going to center around the Fed, and we're trying to hype that up. Not just because there's nothing exciting around it. It's because it actually is pretty freaking important, if you want to use that term. And we've talked a little bit about the history, how and what the Fed actually does, right? Essentially, they control the money supply, which directly has an impact on interest rates. And they're doing that in reaction to inflation. Inflation's incredibly important. We're going to get into a little bit about why that is actually the case. But through these mechanisms, everything else in the economy kind of lives downstream. And so if you haven't heard of the Fed, or you kind of don't pay attention to it because it's a bureaucratic organization or wonky board or organization full of a bunch of economists, it's super important. We're going to talk about it. We're going to get a little bit of the pun intended here, inside baseball perspective on the Fed. But there's going to be a lot more tying it into the 100-year family and really what we do here at AWM. So it's going to be a great conversation. We're super excited about it. But just continuing, Mena, on the setup here, I think the biggest piece, which I that we wanted to really leave people with, I think in this last conversation you and I are having is the power and importance of inflation, really, at the end of the day. Arguably, that's why we're all investing in a simple way. I mean, I think people are investing because they want their money to grow, but at its core, you invest so that your money, the money you save, keeps up with inflation, right? And just unpack that for listeners a little bit more. Like, what is inflation in its simplest sense, but why does it matter?
Yeah, and it all comes back to a term called purchasing power. The Fed is pretty much responsible for preserving the purchasing power of citizens, of employees, and of making sure the way we really do that is make sure that inflation is not rampant. If inflation is rampant, if wages don't grow kind of along with inflation, if you also potentially get a market where inflation far outpaces interest rates, potentially what people can earn in the market with their investment portfolios, what you're doing is you're diminishing your purchasing power. That is a big reason why we're not proponents of holding a ton of cash, because cash is an investment that has maybe a little bit of a return, but it doesn't historically keep up with inflation. So that money that you have, stored under your mattress, that is losing purchasing power every single day. And if you're not investing it, even though it looks the same, it's the same dollar value in front of you, it doesn't have the same purchasing power. So the Fed is trying to make sure to establish a level of inflation that is, call it, not inhibitory to purchasing power and to people's abilities to preserve purchasing power over the short, intermediate, and long terms.
Yeah, that super helpful. I mean, the kind of simple framing here is right why your paycheck keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but you actually feel like you have less money. That's the reverse of what we're talking about. It erodes the purchasing power, going back to your term, of that single dollar.
And people see that kind of across the globe. You know, I am Egyptian. The Egyptian pound has been devalued a ton. There's been crazy inflation. The inflation in that country and inflation in other countries as well. You know, we've had recent stories about inflation in Turkey, inflation in Argentina. That devalues the currency faster than people can make more money, faster than investments grow. And what you're left with is just a population or potentially investors, consumers that have less actual true dollars to spend and to consume with. So that's to everyone's detriment. And what the Fed really is in place to do is set the rules and set the guardrails so that investors are protected when it comes to purchasing power.
Yeah, 100%. So trying to simplify, or let's say like bring this to a conclusion. That is one of the Fed's most important jobs: controlling money supply, to control interest rates, to control inflation, and ideally control the employment situation in the United States. There's other things that the Fed does that's beyond the scope of this conversation, but those two functions, or those two functions, right? We said dual mandate, inflation and employment, are incredibly important to the overall health of the U.S. economy and kind of by extension the global economy as well. But because of that, it's incredibly important for anyone's investing. Certainly, everyone listening here who's a client of AWM, anyone who's potentially investing on their own, it is an incredibly important institution. Do you have to understand the nitty gritty? No, but it's an incredibly important institution that influences and has an impact on all of our journey towards our 100-year family. And so we're super excited to welcome Roger Ferguson Jr. Onto the show. Again, it's going to probably be a much longer form type structure than we're used to. But why we're excited about that is not only because he had a front row seat. He was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve from, I want to make sure I get my dates right here, from 1999 to 2006. He was a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee, which we've talked about. Harvard BA, JD, and PhD in economics there. So great bona fides there. He was also the CEO, of TIAA, which is a fairly large financial institution here in the United States, and almost triple their assets. We're going to get a little bit more into the background, but those are just, let's call it the technical aspects of why we're really excited to welcome Roger onto the podcast here. But I mean, maybe tease out a little bit. Let's like we've talked about. Let's wet everyone's whistle around the 100-year family side of things.
Yeah. So the Fed, I would say, independently is so responsible for, call it, those initial inputs that do influence the 100-year family. What inflation looks like, purchasing power. These are all independently things that influence the 100-year family. And Roger is intimately aware and dealt with them for a pretty expansive period of time and a pretty interesting period of time as well. You know, the dot-com bubble, he was on the Federal Reserve for the dot-com bubble. He was also there for 9/11. People know it's an extremely long time ago, but that was a pretty turbulent time and just markets in general. So the work he did on that point, on just the input side, is huge. And then independently as a human, you know, he's established his 100-year family. You know, Roger Ferguson III, he's Roger Ferguson II. We work with Roger Ferguson III, who is an outstanding human, and his daughter, Caroline, who I haven't met. But Roger Jr. has set up his 100-year family, all while having an extremely successful career, which is kind of what we want all of our clients to do. So I think it's also a chance, you know, to talk all of the nerdy stuff that me and you like to talk, but also to dive into the 100-year family from someone who has been extremely successful professionally and also extremely successful when it comes to establishing something as difficult as the 100-year family. I would argue, being the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve is awesome. Managing $1 trillion is also awesome. Establishing and preserving that 100-year family, I would say, is a bigger accomplishment in general and probably harder to do. It is extremely hard to do that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great place to end, and we will do so there. So if you can't tell, hopefully you guys are all excited as we are about this upcoming conversation we're going to have. It's going to be a great combination of both the technical, the nerdy stuff like Mena just alluded to, right? We'll do our best to educate and inform, because it is important, right? That's what we've been doing over the last few episodes. Hey, this is something that matters. We pay attention to the market, if you will. Market participants, institutional investors are taking a fine-tooth comb to all of the words the Federal Reserve says, and Roger's going to be able to give us a little bit of that inside baseball take. There's been some pretty interesting changes, at least from our perspective there. But in addition to it, why it matters to the young investor, the young athlete, the young CEO, the young founder, whichever role you're in, but also lessons learned, the life history conversation around his own journey in executing on his 100-year family is going to be super, super relevant, certainly to how we think about managing wealth and serving you all, our clients. So super excited about it. Stay tuned. Be on the lookout for various communications, releases, and whatnot from the AWM family here around this conversation. But until then, own your wealth, make an impact, and always be a pro. Thanks for listening.